February 1945, Northern Italy. The Italian front is a place of geological cruelty. Jagged mountains and frozen valleys funnel wind and machine gun fire with equal malice. Here, the Allied advance is measured in bloody yards. The Gothic line is breached, but not broken. Near the shell-battered village of Vinola, the Fifth Army is completely pinned down. 9 German 105mm howitzers, expertly dug into reverse slopes, invisible from the air, have held an entire infantry battalion in a vice for 3 days. Every attempted airstrike has failed. Bombs dropped from safe high altitude scatter harmlessly across the rocky hillside. For the men below, approximate is not enough. They die in the open. Medics cannot move, and the attack has stalled, not for lack of courage, but for a brutal lack of precision. High above, the pilots of the 350th Fighter Squadron hear the desperate calls. They fly their P-47 Thunderbolts at 1,200 feet, following Doctrine, dropping ordnance through cloud cover and pulling away before German flak can find them. It is a compromise born of terrible loss. Dozens of pilots have been lost flying lower. Command no longer asks for volunteers. The calculus is clear. Altitude equals survival. But on the ground, the infantry keeps dying. In this grim stalemate, one pilot keeps asking a different question. His name is Lieutenant Raymond Knight. At 23, he is soft-spoken, a Methodist from Texas with an engineer's mind. He writes letters home every Sunday and reads technical manuals in his bunk. While other pilots relax, Knight walks the flight line, studying bomb fuses and fragmentation patterns. He has flown 64 combat missions, not the most in his squadron. What sets him apart is his perspective. He sees each sortie as a deadly geometry problem. He has calculated that a 500-pound bomb dropped from medium altitude has a margin of error greater than 50 yards. Against a dug-in gun, that's a miss. The only solution is to see the target. To see it, you must fly through the wall of fire no doctrine permits. On the morning of February 24th, after another routine briefing for Vinola, Knight approaches the operations officer. He makes a request that borders on insubordination. He wants to go in alone, at treetop level, and he will not return until every gun is silent. The officer stares, reminds him of the odds, calls it near suicidal. Knight doesn't argue. He simply states his logic. The infantry on the ground is not expendable. 1 pilot and 1 airplane might be. He is willing to be that variable in the equation. He isn't asking for permission twice. The officer doesn't approve, but he doesn't forbid him. As Knight walks to his waiting Thunderbolt, a lone figure against the gray sky, the unspoken truth hangs in the frozen air. He is not just flying to attack. He is flying to test whether one man's calculation can defy an entire army's despair.
To understand why Raymond Knight would volunteer for a near-suicidal mission, one must look not to a pilot's bravado, but to an engineer's blueprint. Born in Houston in 1922, Knight was raised by a construction foreman who taught him to measure twice, cut once. This methodical patience defined him. As a teenager, he built model airplanes with obsessive precision, calculating wing loads and control tensions. When he enlisted after Pearl Harbor, it wasn't for glory, but from a quiet conviction that his skills were needed. Flight training revealed he wasn't a natural stick-and-rudder ace. His reflexes were good, not great. But he possessed an unparalleled capacity for iteration. He would practice a maneuver relentlessly until it became embedded in muscle memory. His evaluation report read, reliable, methodical, unlikely to take unnecessary risks. Assigned to the massive P-47 Thunderbolt, he didn't just learn to fly it, he sought to master its very soul. While others slept, Knight studied technical manuals, sketching fuel systems and hydraulic lines. He knew the armor could stop 20mm shells from the front, the radial engine could lose cylinders and still run, and the 8.50 caliber guns converged at 300 yards. For him, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon, it was a complex, survivable system. In the skies of Italy, he began to see the failed disconnect. Doctrine prioritized pilot survival through altitude, rendering support ineffective. He watched bombs miss, saw men die, and calculated the trigonometry of failure. A plan, cold and logical, formed in his mind. The risk wasn't random, it was a series of variables: speed, altitude, approach angle, and enemy reaction time. He believed he could solve for X. The morning of February 24th presented the exact conditions his plan required. A low overcast at 800 feet and poor visibility, weather that would typically ground close support missions. Knight saw it as perfect camouflage for a lone, low-level approach. As he climbed into his cockpit, his ground crew sensed a different aura. His pre-flight check was, as always, painstakingly thorough, but there was a profound finality to it. He taxied the heavy-laden Thunderbolt, 2 500-pound bombs under its wings, fuel tanks full, guns loaded, with the same calm focus. Taking off into the gloom, he turned north, alone. In the tower, the operations officer watched him disappear, convinced he was writing his own obituary. But Knight felt a strange clarity. The thunder of the engine, the gauges glowing before him, the map on his knee, all were components of the problem. He wasn't flying into chaos, he was executing a calculated experiment. 10 miles from Vinola, he descended, dropping through a hole in the clouds. The world exploded into a rushing blur of snow and stone. Leveling off at 200 feet, then 100, then 60, he became a blur himself, using the terrain as his shield. The ridge, where 9 guns were hidden, lay ahead. He was no longer just a pilot following orders, he was a technician applying a radical hypothesis directly onto the battlefield.
The briefing for the mission near Vinola was starkly routine. Intelligence pointed to suspected artillery positions. The prescribed solution, a medium-altitude attack by a flight of P-47s, dropping 500-pound general-purpose bombs through the cloud cover. The risk was noted as heavy flak. Lieutenant Raymond Knight listened in silence, his mind already rejecting the template. He knew what suspected and medium altitude meant for the infantry below. More craters in empty fields, more stalemate, more death. As the other pilots filed out, Knight approached the squadron's operations officer. What followed was not a debate, but the presentation of an alternative theorem. Knight requested to fly the mission alone. He would go in at treetop level, below the ridgeline, using the terrain as his primary defense. He would make multiple passes, identifying each gun by its muzzle flash and destroying it with precision strafing and bombs. The officer was stunned. This violated every survival doctrine written in blood. The P-47 was tough, but a low, slow pass over concentrated ground fire was a death sentence. Doctrine exists for a reason, he reminded Knight. But Knight, respectful yet unwavering, countered with his engineer's logic. The current doctrine was resulting in a 100% failure rate for the ground forces. He argued that the real risk wasn't in flying low, but in not destroying the targets. He had calculated the angles, the timing, the Thunderbolt's durability. The officer, faced with Knight's cold calculus and the undeniable crisis on the ground, made a fateful non-approval. He wouldn't order this, but he wouldn't ground Knight. No wingman would be ordered to follow. If Knight chose to do this, he would do so on his own authority and his own risk. It was as close to a green light as defiance could get. Knight accepted the terms without another word. Walking to his aircraft, the weight of the decision was palpable, yet it manifested not as fear, but as intense focus. He conducted his pre-flight check with robotic precision, a ritual to cement his mind in the technical, not the mortal. His crew chief, seeing the heavy bomb load and the resolute set of Knight's jaw, understood this sortie was different. As the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared to life, Knight taxied out, a solitary figure in a steel cockpit. From the control tower, the operations officer watched the Thunderbolt vanish into the low overcast, a mixture of dread and awe settling in his gut. He was witnessing either monumental folly or unimaginable courage. Meanwhile, Knight broke through the cloud layer into a gloomy twilight. He was utterly alone, no friendly chatter on the radio, just the drone of his engine. Navigating by map and dead reckoning, he began his descent 10 miles from the target area. Dropping to 200 feet, then 100, the frozen Italian landscape became a streaking tapestry of danger. Hedgerows, stone farmhouses, and skeletal trees flashed beneath his wings. He was flying so low that his propeller wash churned the snow on rooftops. His entire world narrowed to the rushing horizon and the approaching ridgeline, a jagged spine concealing 9 instruments of death. He was no longer just a lieutenant following orders. He had become a lone executor of a forbidden strategy, carrying the hopes of a trapped battalion on his wings and hurtling towards the very heart of the enemy's strength.
The ridge exploded into view. At 60 feet, the world became a violent smear of snow, rock, and sudden movement. Then a stabbing orange flash against the white, a muzzle blast from a camouflaged 105mm howitzer. Knight's mind, trained for this precise moment, switched from navigation to execution. He didn't pull up. Instead, he nudged the Thunderbolt's nose down, the G-force pressing him into his seat, and squeezed the trigger. All 8.5 caliber machine guns erupted, a torrent of tracers and steel that walked across the German position. Snow and dirt geysered. He saw one crewman fall, others scrambling. He flashed over the revetment at 50 feet, the roar of his engine and the chatter of his guns merging into one deafening scream. He pulled into a shallow climb, his eyes already on the mirrors. The gun was damaged, but the crew was reforming. The first part of his theorem was proven. He could find them. Now for the second. He could kill them. Ignoring every survival instinct screaming to gain altitude, he banked hard left, bleeding airspeed to set up another run. This time, the enemy was ready. Rifle and machine gun fire snapped past his canopy. A sharp thud-thud punched through his right wing. The aircraft shuddered, but Knight held his line, his focus narrowing to the gun sight. He pickled one 500-pound bomb, felt the aircraft lurch upward, and hauled back on the stick. The bomb hit short, skipped, and detonated inside the revetment. A secondary explosion tore the howitzer apart, engulfing the position in a fireball. No time for triumph. He was already scanning for the next flash, already calculating his approach on the second gun. He was out of bombs, but not out of targets or ammunition. The remaining German crews, now fully alerted, poured fire skyward. Knight became a relentless, low-flying specter, using the ridgeline itself as cover from heavier flak batteries. His strategy was a brutal loop of observation, attack, and reposition. Spot a target, dive, strafe with precise, controlled bursts to suppress the crew and mark the position, pull up violently, using the P-47's rugged frame to absorb hits, bank around, and strafe again until the position fell silent. Rounds pierced his fuselage. A control cable twanged loose. His hydraulic pressure began to drop. He felt each hit not with panic, but as a technician noting variables in a deteriorating system. His fuel was burning fast, his ammunition counter spinning down. On his 5th pass, a concentrated burst shattered part of his tail. The rudder went mushy. Knight compensated with aileron and throttle, his hands moving on instinct forged by countless hours of study. He pressed on. 6th position. 7th. The Germans, trained to fear high-altitude bombers, were unnerved by this solitary, unstoppable predator at their doorstep. By the time Knight lined up on the 9th and final position, his P-47 was a flying sieve, trailing fuel and smoke. He made one last long strafing run, watching his tracers chew through camouflage netting and ammunition boxes until the crew fled. An eerie silence settled over the ridge. The guns were dead. Checking his gauges, Knight saw the brutal math. 15 minutes of fuel left, critical systems failing. He turned his battered machine south, the weight of his gamble now replaced by the cold, simple task of bringing the data home.
With the 9th German position silenced, a sudden, profound quiet fell over the ridge, a stark contrast to the minutes of continuous roar that had preceded it. Lieutenant Knight's P-47 Thunderbolt, now a crippled beast, trailed a thin, grayish plume of leaking fluids. The cockpit was filled with the acrid smell of cordite, hot metal, and fear that had been meticulously compartmentalized. A glance at his panel told the story. Fuel critical, hydraulic pressure dropping, a jagged hole in the canopy where a rifle round had passed. The ridge, now behind him, was a smoking scar on the landscape. His work was done, but the equation was incomplete. The final variable was his own survival. With roughly 15 minutes of fuel and a shuddering airframe, he turned south towards friendly lines, nursing the wounded Thunderbolt at its most economical cruise setting. Every vibration, every drop in oil pressure was a problem to be managed. He shut down non-essential systems, adjusted the propeller pitch, and calculated his glide slope, treating his dying plane with the same methodical care he had applied to the attack. Below, in the valley, American infantrymen watched in stunned disbelief. The shelling that had plagued them for 72 hours had stopped. As the lone, smoking Thunderbolt passed overhead, some waved, others simply stared, knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. Knight had no time to acknowledge them. His world had shrunk again, now to a single critical task, landing what was left of his aircraft. The airfield control tower spotted him first, a dark, unsteady shape against the gray sky. The telltale smoke and uneven profile signaled a damaged bird. Knight's radio call was calm, devoid of drama. He reported battle damage, low fuel, and a potential issue with his landing gear. As he lined up for final approach, the ground crew saw the full extent of the punishment. Dozens of punctures across the wings and fuselage, a partially missing tail section, and only one main landing wheel visibly down and locked. The other remained stubbornly retracted. A standard landing was impossible. Knight had one shot. He cut power, flared the heavy aircraft expertly, and let the P-47 settle onto the single good wheel. As the weight came down, the damaged tire blew instantly. The aircraft slammed onto its belly, metal screeching against the pierced steel planking of the runway in a shower of sparks. Knight fought the rudder to keep it straight as it careened down the strip before finally grinding to a halt in the grass beside the taxiway. Inside the cockpit, he went through his shutdown checklist with robotic precision, turning off switches and cutting fuel valves to prevent fire. Only when the propeller stopped its final jerking rotation did he allow himself a moment of stillness. Then, unstrapping himself, he pushed open the battered canopy, climbed out onto the wing, and slid to the ground. He walked a slow circle around his aircraft, silently assessing the damage. Over 100 holes, a severed control cable dangling from the tail. Then he turned and walked towards the operations hut, not as a returning hero, but as an engineer whose field test was complete, ready to deliver his data. The walk from his shattered Thunderbolt to the operations shack was a quiet, solitary procession. Ground crew and other pilots stopped to stare, not at Knight,
but at the aircraft he had somehow flown home. Inside the hut, he approached the intelligence officer's desk with the same calm demeanor he'd had at the morning briefing. His flight suit smelled of smoke and oil, his face was smudged with grime, but his hands were steady as he filled out the after-action report. In a matter-of-fact technical prose, he distilled the 11 minutes over Vinola into cold data. 9 artillery positions confirmed and destroyed, used all ordnance and approximately 3,000 rounds of .45 caliber, received heavy ground fire, aircraft damaged but repairable, no observed friendly casualties, request permission to repeat tactic if similar targets are identified. There was no mention of fear, heroism, or the sheer improbability of his survival. Tonight, it was a simple summary of a completed task. The operations officer, who had expected to write a letter of condolence, read the report in stunned silence. He called Knight into his office. "You're insane," he stated flatly, looking over the damage report from the crew chief. Then, after a long pause, he added, "You're also getting a medal, and you are never to fly a solo low-level mission again without direct orders from Group." Knight merely nodded, accepting both the praise and the restriction with equal indifference. His mind had already moved on, analyzing the flight data, considering improvements for next time. The impact of his mission rippled outwards faster than any official report. Within hours, a handwritten note arrived from the commander of the infantry battalion that had been pinned down. It expressed profound gratitude and asked if there was anything they could do. Knight's reply was typical. He requested spare coffee. The next day, a full case arrived at the squadron. Among fellow pilots, the reaction was a mixture of awe and skepticism. Some questioned his sanity, others his tactics. When asked how he survived, Knight would explain patiently, drawing diagrams of his attack angles and emphasizing the importance of using terrain to mask approach. A few tried to emulate him on subsequent missions, but most lacked his perfect blend of icy nerve, pre-calculated geometry, and intimate understanding of the P-47's limits. They either pulled off early or took severe damage for little result. Knight, however, had earned a unique unspoken status. Command no longer briefed him on how to fly, they briefed him on what needed to be destroyed. 6 days later, on March 2nd, they gave him another stalled infantry problem near Pra del Biano. Again he flew alone and low. Again he returned with a plane riddled with holes and a list of destroyed machine gun nests and anti-tank guns. This time his engine quit on the taxiway. The unspoken ban on his methods was quietly lifted. Doctrine had not changed on paper, but in the skies over the Italian front, a dangerous, effective new precedent had been set by a quiet lieutenant who saw war not as a clash of wills, but as a series of engineering problems demanding urgent solutions.
Lieutenant Knight's unorthodox methods, born from necessity, were grudgingly accepted as a necessary evil by command. For the next 2 months, he became a specialist for impossible targets. He was not ordered to fly low. He was simply given objectives others had failed to destroy and allowed to solve the problem. His aircraft returned damaged more often than not, but the ground commander's gratitude was effusive. However, the relentless calculus of risk could only balance for so long. On April 24, 1945, with the German front in Italy collapsing, Knight took off on his 97th combat mission. The target was a reported supply convoy near the town of Gaiti, a final pocket of resistance. He found the convoy on a winding mountain road and began his characteristic low-level strafing runs, destroying several trucks. On his third pass, concentrated fire from a hidden anti-aircraft gun found its mark. A shell shattered his engine's cooling system. Glycol coolant, white and dense, sprayed across his windshield, blinding him. With the engine seizing, Knight had a split second to choose: bail out over enemy territory and risk capture, or attempt a controlled crash. Ever the pragmatist, he chose the latter. Using his last moments of control, he dead-sticked the heavy P-47 into a narrow, rocky field behind what he believed to be enemy lines. The belly landing was executed with textbook precision. No fire, no explosion. He climbed out, armed only with his .45 pistol and an escape kit, and began walking west towards the Allied advance. His freedom lasted less than 2 hours. A patrol of weary but vigilant Wehrmacht soldiers captured him without a fight. He was taken to a makeshift interrogation post, then transferred to a transient POW camp as the German military machine unraveled around him. His war, however, was truly over. Just 5 days later, on April 29th, advancing Allied units overran the camp, liberating Knight and others. He was debriefed, given fresh clothes, and returned to his squadron on May 2nd. Germany surrendered 5 days later. The man who had rewritten tactical manuals in the sky was now a quiet spectator to victory. The official recognition came later, the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation detailed the Vinola mission with clinical precision. At the ceremony, Knight stood stiffly, accepted the medal with a handshake, and offered no heroic speeches to reporters. To him, it was an artifact of a solved problem. The real legacy was invisible. In the months and years that followed, his after-action reports and gun camera footage were studied. His methodology, the calculated use of terrain, the precise strafing runs, and the acceptance of controlled risk was distilled into new close air support protocols. Low-altitude attacks were no longer strictly forbidden. They were taught as a high-skill option. The Knight approach became a case study in turning desperation into doctrine, proving that survival and effectiveness were not mutually exclusive when guided by a cool mind and unwavering purpose.
After the war, Raymond Knight returned to Texas, a place untouched by the jagged ridges of Italy. He used the GI Bill to study civil engineering, married, raised a family, and built a career in construction. A quiet life of measured progress. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked, he described it in the same factual tone one might use to explain a complex blueprint, a series of problems that required solutions. His children discovered his Distinguished Service Cross in a drawer, a relic from another life. To them, he was simply a father who liked to build things. He never considered himself a hero. He was a technician whose battlefield happened to be the sky. In 2003, he passed away quietly, his funeral attended by family and a few old squadron mates. There were no grand eulogies. His tangible legacy was a footlocker of papers he donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Among engineering sketches and faded maps were notebooks with a penciled entry from March 1945. Doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of those who survived, but survival alone does not win wars. Someone must test what wisdom forbids, because the alternative is unacceptable loss. It was the closest he ever came to a philosophy. Knight's true monument was not made of stone, but of influence. His after-action reports and analyzed gun camera footage became foundational texts in the evolution of close air support. The lesson from Vinola was clear. Precision could outweigh peril if the risk was calculated and the execution flawless. His methods were formalized, teaching new generations of pilots that low-altitude tactics were not suicidal, but a high-skilled tool, requiring an engineer's mind and a steady nerve. The ridge near Vinola is now peaceful farmland, the gun positions long gone. The men who survived that day never knew the name of the pilot who saved them. They only knew the shelling stopped, and they could advance. This is the silent legacy of the quiet heroes. Raymond Knight proved that audacity and logic are not opposites, but partners. In 11 minutes over a frozen Italian ridge, he demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let calculation become an excuse for inaction. His story, embedded in tactical manuals and the unmarked fields of Italy, remains a permanent lesson. In the cold algebra of war, results are the only monument that matters.